a place often seen as the beating heart of the Catholic world, holy, sacred, and humble. It presents itself as a servant of the poor, a symbol of spiritual devotion, a city built on faith, not fortune. But there's another side to this story, one that's rarely discussed out loud. Because hidden behind the marble columns and towering cathedrals lies something the church doesn't often mention: money. A lot of it. Over the centuries, the Vatican has quietly built one of the most powerful financial networks on the planet. It owns real estate in some of the world's most expensive cities. It holds investments in international banks, companies, and even movie studios. Its private bank, known as the Institute for Works of Religion, operates with a level of secrecy rivaling intelligence agencies. Few know exactly how much it controls. Even fewer know how that money is used. The Vatican doesn't pay taxes, it doesn't publish full financial statements, and it's not held accountable by any government. So where does the money come from? Donations, tourism, historical deals, and perhaps more importantly, where does it go? Does it reach the poor, as the church claims, or is it funneled into luxury, politics, and power behind the scenes? For centuries, the faithful have given what they could, believing their money would serve the mission of Christ. But investigations tell a different story, one of hidden accounts, lavish spending, and quiet cover-ups. This isn't an attack on belief, it's a search for truth. Because when a spiritual empire holds billions in silence, the world has a right to ask, where does the Vatican's wealth really go? The origins of Vatican wealth. Let's go back in time to the early centuries of Christianity. The church began as a humble movement, but as it grew in followers, so did its influence and its finances. By the 4th century, after Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, the church began receiving massive land donations from the faithful. Kings, nobles, and emperors granted properties, privileges, and power in exchange for spiritual favor and eternal salvation. These were not just gifts, they were investments in heaven. Over time, the Vatican became one of the largest landowners in Europe. And with land came wealth, rental income, agricultural profits, and political leverage. By the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just preaching to the masses, it was collecting taxes from them. Tithes, indulgences, and fees for sacraments poured in from across the continent. During the Renaissance, the Vatican reached the height of its financial power. Popes like Julius II and Leo X commissioned grand architecture, timeless paintings, and gold-draped chapels, not from personal fortune, but from the pockets of the faithful. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, funded by church collections. St. Peter's Basilica, built on the back of indulgence money. The Vatican's image shifted from a house of worship to a center of political and economic influence. And that legacy of wealth didn't vanish. It was preserved, protected, passed down through generations of clergy and cardinals. Today, much of that treasure still exists, hidden behind sealed archives, private vaults, and centuries of silence. The Vatican became more than a religious institution. It became a financial empire. And while the faithful continued to give, the Vatican continued to grow. Because the origins of its wealth were never about poverty or simplicity. They were built on power, politics, and the promise of salvation for a price. Real estate, gold, and global assets. Let's talk about what the Vatican actually owns today. We're not just talking about churches and chapels. The Vatican controls a vast portfolio of real estate across the globe worth billions. From lavish buildings in the heart of Rome to luxury apartments in London's most expensive districts. From commercial complexes in Paris to quiet investments in Switzerland and Germany. Many of these properties are owned through complex networks of shell companies and holding groups, making them difficult to trace. Some buildings are rented out to embassies, others to elite tenants. A few are simply left empty, appreciating in value year after year. Then there's the gold. The Vatican holds millions, some estimate even billions, in gold reserves. Some reports suggest large portions are stored in the US Federal Reserve. Others hint at private European banks. But the exact amount? That remains a tightly guarded secret. And that's just the start. The Vatican is also a global investor. It operates quietly in financial markets through a range of offshore accounts and third-party firms. At the center of this system is the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for Works of Religion, or IOR. This isn't your ordinary bank. The IOR serves fewer than 20,000 clients, mostly high-ranking clergy, religious orders, and Vatican-connected institutions, yet it manages hundreds of millions in assets. Its inner workings are mostly off-limits to outside scrutiny. Audits are rare. Transparency is minimal. This financial web gives the Vatican power and insulation. It can move money without oversight. It can grow its wealth quietly, far from public view. So while the faithful light candles, The Vatican lights up balance sheets most people will never see, because this church is also a corporation. The Vatican Bank controversies. Let's now enter one of the most secretive corners of the Vatican's empire, its bank. Officially known as the Institute for Works of Religion, or IOR, the Vatican Bank was founded in 1942. Its purpose? To manage money for religious orders, charities, and Vatican departments. But over time, it became known not for its holiness, but for its scandals. In the 1980s, one of the biggest financial controversies in European history erupted: the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. This Italian bank had deep ties to the Vatican Bank, so deep, in fact, that when it crumbled under billions in debt, the Vatican's name was all over the fallout. Its chairman, Roberto Calvi, was found dead, hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge. Many believe it wasn't suicide. This wasn't just a bank failure, it was a web of offshore accounts, mafia links, political money, and church connections. Since then, multiple scandals have emerged. The Vatican Bank has been accused of money laundering, fraudulent transfers, and even helping dictators hide money. From Argentina to Eastern Europe, shady transactions have passed through its vaults with little to no oversight. Efforts to reform the bank began in the early 2000s, with new popes promising transparency and internal audits. But insiders say change has been slow. Real accountability? Still lacking. The Vatican Bank is not subject to the same international financial regulations as other banks. It operates under its own rules, within the sovereign walls of Vatican City. Audits are rare, oversight is minimal, and even today, very little is known about who holds accounts inside and how much they hold. In a world demanding financial accountability, the Vatican Bank remains an enigma, because when the church controls its own bank behind its own borders, who's really watching? Where does the money actually go? According to official church statements, the funds support religious missions, education, humanitarian aid, and the upkeep of Vatican operations. They say it's all used in the service of God, supporting the poor, helping the sick, and preserving centuries-old holy sites. But critics and even some insiders tell a different story. They argue that only a small fraction of the Vatican's enormous wealth ever reaches those in real need. Donations flow in from across the world, but where they end up, that's harder to trace. Take Peter's Pence, for example. It's a global annual donation drive where Catholics are encouraged to give generously to support the Pope's charitable efforts. But leaked documents and investigative reports show something troubling. Large portions of Peter's Pence money meant for the poor have reportedly been redirected. Instead of going to feed the hungry or shelter the homeless, funds were used to cover Vatican budget shortfalls, or even invested in luxury real estate in London. In some cases, millions of dollars were tied up in opaque financial schemes far removed from charity work. For the average believer in the pew, the expectation is simple. You give out of faith, and the church acts in good faith. But when secrecy surrounds spending and charity becomes a talking point rather than a priority, people start asking hard questions. Is the Vatican truly using its wealth to serve? Or is the line between spiritual mission and financial empire getting harder to see? Power, politics, and financial secrecy. Let's ask the uncomfortable question. Why does the church need so much money? The answer is influence. In today's world, wealth isn't just about comfort, it's about control. And the Vatican knows this well. Money buys political access, it funds lobbyists, finances media outreach, and builds quiet partnerships with those in power. From European parliaments to South American regimes, the church's financial reach goes far beyond religious missions. Insiders, some of whom have left under pressure, claim that attempts to audit or reform the Vatican's finances are often blocked from the inside. Whistleblowers have been sidelined, investigations buried. Because transparency threatens more than the bank, it threatens the power structure itself. And power is sacred. Over the years, the Vatican has formed financial ties with governments, corporations, and private networks that protect it from scrutiny. It operates as both a sovereign state and a global institution immune to most external pressure. This dual identity allows it to speak the language of faith on Sunday and the language of finance on Monday. Meanwhile, the church's public message remains centered on simplicity, charity, and humility. But the contrast is striking. A priest calls for sacrifice from a pulpit lined with gold. A bishop preaches humility from a palace. And behind them, vaults remain sealed, unopened, and unexplained. For many, faith remains unshaken, but the institution built around it grows more difficult to question. Because in the Vatican, wealth isn't just about survival. It's about silence, control, and power. Conclusion includes faith, money, and accountability. This isn't an attack on faith. It's not about tearing down religion or disrespecting belief. It's about asking the questions many have been afraid to ask for far too long. Should a spiritual institution, one that preaches humility, poverty, and compassion, control billions in global assets while millions of people go hungry? Should a church built on sacrifice operate in secrecy, shielded from financial transparency and accountability? Because at its core, faith is about trust. And when the faithful give, they give with that trust. But trust demands truth. And the truth is, much of the Vatican's wealth remains hidden behind closed doors, private vaults, and centuries-old silence. The Church holds incredible influence, morally, spiritually, and financially. But with influence comes responsibility. If the Vatican is to serve the world as a beacon of hope and light, then it must also be willing to face the shadows of its wealth. The world is no longer staying quiet. Researchers, journalists, and believers alike are beginning to demand answers. Because in the end, faith doesn't fear the truth. It embraces it. Thanks for watching. If this opened your eyes, consider subscribing for more untold stories and hidden truths. What do you think about the Vatican's wealth? Let us know in the comments below. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, even the oldest institutions have secrets worth uncovering.